On the evening of December 16, 1985, John Gotti sat in the passenger seat of a parked car on East 46th Street in Manhattan, approximately 30 yards from the entrance of Sparks Steakhouse, and watched the operation he had ordered unfold in real time. At approximately 5:26 in the evening, Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family and the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States, stepped onto the sidewalk outside the restaurant and was shot dead. His driver, Thomas Bellotti, was killed simultaneously in the car at the curb. Gotti watched from 30 yards away, then gave the order to drive. He was 45 years old. He assumed control of the Gambino family before midnight. He would die in a federal prison hospital 17 years later, in continuous federal custody since his arrest in December 1990, having never been free again. The interval between those two events, and the specific conduct that produced it, is what this episode documents. In December 1985, the Gambino family was the largest and financially most powerful organized crime family in the United States. Its reach extended across construction, labor unions, cargo operations at JFK Airport and the New York ports, and street-level criminal enterprises throughout the metropolitan region. The family had been built by Carlo Gambino, who led it from the late 1950s until his death of natural causes in October 1976. Gambino had operated with a specific and deliberate commitment to personal invisibility. He avoided press attention, avoided public identification, and managed the organization through careful institutional discipline. He died at home, in his bed, of a heart attack at the age of 74, never having been convicted on federal charges as boss. He left the organization to his cousin by marriage, Paul Castellano. Castellano managed the family with a preference for corporate criminal enterprise over street operations. According to Selwyn Raab in 5 Families, his emphasis on legitimate business infiltration and white-collar criminal activity kept him physically removed from the street-level soldiers who carried out the family's violent work, and that distance bred sustained resentment in the ranks. The man who organized that resentment into a vehicle for his own ambitions was a captain from Ozone Park, Queens, named John Gotti. The Castellano murder on December 16, 1985, was how that vehicle arrived at its destination. John Joseph Gotti was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx and grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, the 5th of 13 children in a working-class family. His association with organized crime began in adolescence. By the early 1960s, he had become a formal associate of the Gambino family, assigned to the crew of Capo Carmine Fatico at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park. In the late 1960s, he was convicted on federal hijacking charges and served time at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. The event that decisively elevated his standing within the family came in June 1973. A man named James McBratney had been identified as responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Emmanuel Gambino, a nephew of boss Carlo Gambino. Gotti tracked McBratney to a bar in Staten Island. The confrontation ended with McBratney shot and killed. Gotti pleaded guilty to attempted manslaughter in 1975 and served 4 years at Greenhaven Correctional Facility in New York. The nature of the crime, carried out directly in service of the Gambino family's interests, in response to the murder of the boss's own nephew, gave Gotti a specific and durable credibility within the family's senior leadership. When he was released in 1977, he was formally inducted as a made member of the Gambino family. His rise through the family's ranks was cultivated through his relationship with Agnello Della Croce, the family's underboss, who served as an institutional bridge between the street-level soldiers Gotti represented and the corporate management philosophy of Castellano above. Della Croce recognized in Gotti what Castellano did not appear to value: a street-capable leader with the loyalty of the men below him, the organizational ambition to build beyond his own crew, and the credibility that came from having done dangerous work personally. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Gotti built the Bergin crew into one of the most productive and most loyal units in the family's structure. When promotions came, they came because Della Croce advocated for them. As long as Della Croce lived, the tension between Gotti's faction and Castellano's leadership had an institutional manager who could contain it. When Della Croce died of cancer on December 2, 1985, that check was removed. Gotti moved within 2 weeks. After the Castellano murder, Gotti consolidated control quickly. He relocated his base of operations from Queens to the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. He installed Salvatore Gravano as underboss and Frank Locascio as acting consigliere. He held the position of boss of the most powerful organized crime family in the United States for 6 years. What he did during those 6 years is what the federal record documents in detail, and what organized crime historians describe in consistent terms as operationally self-defeating behavior, driven by a quality the historical literature names without ambiguity: vanity. The vanity operated on 3 specific and interconnected levels, each reinforcing and compounding the others. The first was his deliberate cultivation of public visibility. From early in his tenure as boss, Gotti held what amounted to public audiences outside the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, receiving visitors on the sidewalk in full view of the street, accepting the attention of photographers, arriving to court appearances in expensive tailored clothing, chosen to project confidence. The New York tabloids gave him names that he did not appear to find unwelcome. They called him the Dapper Don. After his acquittals, they called him the Teflon Don. There is no evidence in the documented record that he discouraged either characterization. According to FBI Gambino family surveillance files compiled throughout the late 1980s, the Ravenite Social Club was placed under sustained FBI observation from shortly after Gotti relocated there in 1986. The FBI's Gambino squad made the club its primary surveillance focal point precisely because Gotti's public presence and predictable appearances made it the logical center of the investigation. He made the surveillance easy. The resources directed at the Gambino family investigation under Gotti's leadership were substantially larger than those directed at the family under Castellano, in part because Gotti made that investment of resources rational and politically unavoidable. The second level was the operational overconfidence that his acquittals systematically produced. Between 1984 and 1990, Gotti was tried and acquitted on 4 separate occasions. In 1984, he was acquitted in Queens on assault and theft charges after the principal complainant told the court he could no longer recall the incident. In 1986, he was acquitted on federal RICO charges in the Eastern District, an acquittal subsequently determined to have involved the bribery of jury foreman George Pape, who had received approximately $60,000 to deliver a not guilty verdict. In 1987, he was acquitted on assault charges in Brooklyn. In 1990, he was acquitted on state charges in Manhattan. 4 acquittals. Each one was covered by the press as further evidence that criminal charges could not hold him. The press was wrong. Gotti appears to have accepted the press's conclusion as accurate. According to Jerry Capecci and Gene Mustaine's Gotti, Rise and Fall, the acquittals produced a measurable shift in his operational behavior. His willingness to discuss sensitive criminal matters in fixed, predictable locations increased after each verdict. He held the conversations that would destroy him, not because he had no alternative, but because he had concluded that federal prosecution could not reach him. He was wrong about that too. The third level was the most consequential, and it is documented with the specificity of evidence admitted at trial. It was what the Ravenite apartment recordings captured Gotti saying about Salvatore Gravano. Gotti's response to the problem of FBI street surveillance on Mulberry Street was to relocate sensitive conversations from the sidewalk to a private apartment on the upper floor of the Ravenite building, where he believed discussions were shielded from federal monitoring. The FBI's Gambino squad, tracking Gotti's behavioral patterns through sustained surveillance, obtained a court-authorized warrant and placed listening devices inside that apartment. The recordings produced beginning in 1989 admitted into evidence in United States v. Gotti, documented Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio discussing the 1985 Castellano murder, the ongoing operation of the Gambino family's criminal enterprises, and internal organizational decisions. The recordings gave federal prosecutors what 6 years of investigation and 4 prior prosecutions had not been able to produce: direct voice evidence, in Gotti's own words, of the racketeering conspiracy charged in the indictment. But beyond the criminal conduct, the recordings captured Gotti discussing Salvatore Gravano in terms that made unmistakably clear that Gotti regarded his underboss as a figure whose accumulated authority and income had grown beyond what he was prepared to accept. The recordings documented Gotti characterizing Gravano as an organizational problem, a figure who had taken too much and who would need to be managed. In the institutional language of a criminal organization, the implication of those characterizations was not ambiguous. When Gotti and Gravano were arrested together in December 1990, Gravano's attorneys received the Ravenite recordings through the pre-trial discovery process. According to Peter Maas's underboss, based on Maas's direct interviews with Gravano, it was specifically those recordings, hearing his own boss describe him as a liability and position him to bear the blame for the prosecution's case, that produced Gravano's decision to cooperate with the federal government. He concluded that cooperation was survival. He agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in November 1991. Salvatore Gravano was, at the time of his cooperation, the highest-ranking organized crime figure to become a federal cooperating witness since Joseph Valachi appeared before the McClellan Senate Committee in 1963. He admitted to participating in 19 murders in the course of his career in the Gambino family. The Ravenite recordings had given prosecutors their documentary evidence. Gotti's recorded complaints about his own underboss had given that underboss a specific and documented reason to become the government's primary witness. Gotti had not simply failed to protect himself. He had manufactured, through his own recorded voice, the instrument of his own conviction. The FBI's Gambino squad, under the supervisory direction of Special Agent Bruce Mao, had targeted Gotti across nearly 7 years of investigation before the Ravenite apartment recordings produced the quality of evidence that made the 1992 prosecution viable. The formal indictment, United States v. Gotti, filed in the Eastern District of New York in 1991, charged Gotti with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, the murder of Paul Castellano, the murder of Thomas Bellotti, and other criminal acts established in the recorded evidence. The lead trial prosecutor was Assistant United States Attorney John Gleason, working under U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney. Gravano testified at trial for 9 days. He described the planning and authorization of the Castellano murder, identified Gotti as the organizing authority, and corroborated the criminal conduct documented in the Ravenite recordings with direct personal testimony. Defense attorneys challenged his credibility as a man who had admitted to 19 murders and was receiving sentencing consideration in exchange for cooperation. The jury deliberated for approximately 13 hours. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. On June 23, 1992, United States District Court Judge I. Leo Glasser sentenced John Gotti to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus fines of $250,000. The consequences extended beyond Gotti alone. Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were killed on a Manhattan sidewalk in December 1985, as overt acts in furtherance of a racketeering conspiracy. Their families received nothing from the organization whose leadership dispute produced their deaths. Gravano's cooperation implicated Gambino family members across the organization's structure, and cascading federal investigations through the 1990s produced additional indictments and convictions at multiple levels of the family. Gotti's son, John A. Gotti, attempted to assume operational control of the family and was himself indicted on federal racketeering charges, pleading guilty in 1999 and receiving a sentence of 77 months. Peter Gotti, John Gotti's brother, assumed nominal leadership and was convicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced in 2004. According to Selwyn Raab's 5 families, the Gambino family's institutional authority contracted significantly across the decade following the 1992 conviction. The most powerful organized crime organization in the United States in December 1985 was, by the early 2000s, a fraction of the entity Gotti had seized. John Gotti entered the Federal Bureau of Prisons following his sentencing in June 1992 and was assigned to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, at that time the highest security federal penitentiary in the United States, operating under a permanent control unit lockdown established following the murders of 2 correctional officers at Marion in October 1983. Inmates at Marion were confined to individual cells for approximately 22 to 23 hours per day, with strictly controlled movement and heavily monitored communications. It was the precise inversion of the life Gotti had built on Mulberry Street: the public audiences, the photographers, the tailored suits, the tabloid celebrity. At Marion, he was an inmate number in a control unit cell. The visibility he had cultivated so deliberately as boss had no function of any kind inside those walls. In the late 1990s, Gotti was diagnosed with squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck. The disease advanced despite treatment available within the federal prison medical system. He was eventually transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the Springfield Federal Medical Facility. He was 61 years old. He had been in continuous federal custody since December 1990, 11 years and 6 months. He did not leave federal custody alive. Judge Glass's sentence was carried out to its conclusion. Organized crime historians document the Gotti years in consistent terms. Selwyn Raab's 5 families, Capecchi and Mustaines Gotti, Rise and Fall, and Peter Maas's underboss, all converge on the same central argument, that Gotti's deliberate cultivation of public visibility was operationally incompatible with organized crime leadership of any sustainable duration. The comparison embedded in the historical record is instructive. Carlo Gambino ran the family Gotti later seized for approximately 19 years, died of natural causes at home at 74, and was never convicted as boss. Vincent Gigante, who ran the Genovese family across the same years as Gotti, avoided federal conviction until 1997 through the opposite approach: minimal public presence, deliberate obscurity, a systematic refusal to be seen or photographed in any context that acknowledged his leadership role. Gigante was known publicly, if at all, as an eccentric shuffling through Greenwich Village in a bathrobe. He evaded prosecution until the age of 69. The documented record does not contain a single instance in which Gotti's public celebrity produced an operational benefit to the Gambino family that came close to approximating the cost it imposed on the organization's security. He made himself worth watching. The federal government watched. What it recorded ended him. It bears stating, as it always bears stating on this channel, that the men of organized crime documented in this episode represent a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader Italian-American community built American cities, served in 2 world wars, founded industries, and contributed to American life across every profession and every civic institution. The neighborhoods of East New York, Ozone Park, and Little Italy from which these criminal figures emerged were communities of working families, most of whom had no connection to organized crime, and many of whom suffered from its presence. John Gotti was born in poverty in the South Bronx to a family of 13 children. The path he chose was his own. The community from which he came bears no responsibility for those choices. What the Gotti case reveals about organized crime as an institution is what the Commission case and the Pizza Connection and a generation of RICO prosecutions each reveal in their own way: that the institution's long-term existence had depended not on genuine untouchability, but on discipline, on the willingness of the men who led it to subordinate personal ego to operational survival. The federal government had been trying to bring down the American Mafia's senior leadership for decades. What changed in the 1980s was not the government's desire or its legal tools. RICO had existed since 1970. What changed was the behavior of the men the government was targeting. Gotti's contribution to the documented record is a specific and sustained demonstration of what happens when institutional discipline fails entirely, preserved in recordings made inside a building he entered willingly, on a street where he held court by choice, in a city where he made himself the most visible organized crime boss in American history. The government didn't find him. He found the government. The next episode documents the only boss in the history of the American Mafia who wrote a published memoir about his own life and his own organization, in direct defiance of everything that omertà required of him, and who lived to the age of 97 to see what became of the family he had built. The Joe Bonanno story is next Tuesday. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. 5 Families Files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been 5 Families Files. Good night from the archive.